I hail from South Africa. I want to chat to you and introduce the technical frames used in online reports on lesbian murders in South Africa, which is a PhD study that I had done, or it is a component of a PhD study that I did. And the main aim here is to investigate and to look at not only the technical online frames used when reporting on these incidences of murder, but also to conceptualize the term queercide. So today what I will be presenting is a very brief overview of the background to the study, as well as the research problem and hypothesis developed to investigate the particular issue, and then previous literature findings and key takeaways. So South Africa has a very liberal constitution, and I think that it hails from a very difficult struggle that we went through during the apartheid regime. So with the incumbent ANC government, there was the re-articulation of the Freedom Charter that was then broadened into the Constitution, or large parts of it was developed into the Constitution as we know it today. Now, over and above the addressing racial segregation, it also then included the LGBTIQ community. So even though the laws and the Constitution is very liberal and progressive, the implementation thereof, or the execution and defense thereof, is very often in contradiction with practice and cultural norms and mores. So that kind of sets the context for the South African social political environment. And then also, what further problematizes the issue of queercide and lesbian murders specifically is that there is no official reporting body. So we have to rely on non-profit organizations like Luliki Sizwe to communicate through what their experiences and reflect on what their experiences are. So while I'm going through this presentation, what I would like the audience or participants to do is to reflect on and ask the question, why generating statistics and developing language is so important when it comes to cases of, like corrective and curative rape, queercide, gender-based violence. Why it's so important for not only local authorities, but also international bodies to have accurate statistics informing their policy development. Then also, from these non-profit organizations, what has been communicated through is, in the last few years, locally, there's been an increase in violence against LGBTIQ people in South Africa. Now, I don't know whether it's due to more conversations being had around the issue, or media exposure and more platforms that can give traction to these cases. But we generally get our ideas through non-profit organizations. Now, it doesn't help that in the larger African continental context, there's still a lot of discriminatory policies being developed and implemented. So one of them, for example, is the anti-homosexuality bill from Uganda that was passed on the 25th of April, and that imposes the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality. And then the other thing that I also need to talk about, just to understand the concept behind the technical frames, is to look also to technical and ideological frames used in online reports of the phenomenon of lesbian murders. So the key problem that was then used to investigate was that there isn't any information on the technical frames being used in online reports on South African cases where lesbians were murdered. So we don't necessarily know, where there are technical online frames and ideological online frames used in general reports or reports considered as good, and how those compare So what the differences and similarities are between these and then online reports. So in order to investigate violence against the LGBTIQ community, I shifted my gaze to specifically incorporate the field of journalism and how media is then used to create discursive spaces. But that then also opened up a secondary problem, the lack of language. And that is why it is important to contextualize, or not contextualize, but to conceptualize queerside as part of gender studies, but then also academic discourse. So the assumption here was that there's a difference in the way that good online reports are technically framed and the frames then used in those reports on lesbian murders, on queer side, which is a subcategory of queer side. So the seminal sources, and there are quite a few, but the two main seminal sources is Zanele Moholi, which is a visual artist and queer activist, and she really talks about the lived experiences of Black lesbians in especially townships and more socioeconomically depressed communities. And then also Judith Butler, which is a very well-known gender theorist, and her claim to fame, if I can phrase it that way, basically comes from talking about performativity. But for this particular study, her work around standpoint theory and perspectivism was quite insightful. And then the theoretical frameworks that was used to further the research problem, or to address the research problem, was standpoint theory from Judith Butler, and then also framing and representation theory from De Vries, Chong, and Druckmann, because we were talking about journalism frames. Other readings or other literature that informed the study also came from various different authors, and I'm just going to embolden or highlight the key takeaways from those readings. The first one is the concept of queerside. So it's basically a neologism, so a newly developed concept that was used in a conference paper, but it's not really part of academic discourse at the current moment. So it's a portmanteau between queer and homicide. And it's when you start looking at the reports on queer side, it's not a very popular, if you compare it to political scandal, for example, or if you compare it to entertainment news or sporting events, it's not a very popular issue to report on, and specifically because it doesn't generate a lot of revenue building content. And then also online media platforms are known to give more exposure and create salience for more subversive groups. Some of the ways in which they address this is by connecting people to ideas and ideas to people. So very often when I have conversations with people surrounding issues of or differentiations between gender and sex, for example, you can see that, you know, these two terms often get confused. And because of this confusion, discourses start to skew into polarity. So either people that believe one certain thing and people that believe the polar opposite. So the media can help to clarify that as well. And then the technical frames, and this is the most important part, that was sort of priori developed from these readings, were the length of online reports, share features, comments sections, whether articles were submitted and then received either critical recognition or industry accolade, and then also whether there were sources consulted in the article. But I only used the first four, and the reason why I didn't use sources consulted is because this isn't what made reports unique. It didn't differentiate between a good report and an online report on queer side, because sources were used, but how sources were used, that's what's quite interesting. And I'll very, very quickly touch on that, and then I'll get to the findings. But the way in which sources were used for queer side articles is these sources had an objective epistemic perspective, meaning that it was like a police officer or an investigating or a arrest warrant officer, or it was a judge, or it was one of the, a person in the public or in the community. But the sources used in good articles were people with subjective epistemic perspectives. So these were, partners of the victim, or a sister, or a brother, or a best friend, or a neighbor, which really gave face and personality to the victim, in opposition, obviously, to the online reports on queer side, which was very generic and broad. So it is important, and I can show the names and faces because it's a matter of public record. But these were the 4 case studies that were used. From a broad overview, there were about 10,800 online reports as part of the population. But then after putting certain characteristics in place to really focus and make the case studies comparable, I was left with about 70 online reports. I chose a victimology from different demographics, classes, races, marital status. I chose a variant difference so that I could see what the similarities and the differences were in how these cases were reported on. But these were the 4 cases. If you want to go and search these names and look at these cases from a criminological perspective, it's quite fascinating. But yeah. So from these 70 reports that then were pulled, what was quite interesting is that only 36% of them had were reports that were of a considered good length, which is between 400 and 800 words. If you use too few words, then you fail to contextualize the issue properly or the case properly. And if you use too many words for online readers, you lose your reader. They just go on to the next news snippet, or you tend to lose them. Then also only 37% of these reports had the share feature. Only 16% of these had the comments or self-regulatory features, and none of the 70 online reports were sent through, received, nominated, awarded any kind of industry accolades or recognition. So then from this study, this is a Venn diagram to really show what the differences and similarities are. And the reason why I then didn't look at the sources that were acknowledged, because the sources were acknowledged in all of them. Another technical frame that could have been used is also the format, whether there were headings and subheadings used, and in all of those headings and monikers were used, like lesbian, for example, or homosexual woman. These were monikers that were used throughout, whether it was a good report or a report on queer side. So the key takeaway, I think, from this then is that if you wanted to write on the issue as a journalist or an online reporter, or even have conversations about the issue, to keep the length of the online report of queer sites between 401 to 800 words. Also to ensure that you include the share feature, to capitalize on economy of scale. And then also to include comment features so that you can engage your reader, so that they can participate and fact check and really become part of. And then also to submit these online reports Queer Side to industry and community awards, to receive feedback, but then also to get exposure and to create a little bit more salience for the particular issue. And then there's a contribution from Simpson and Cote that also sort of emerged from the study. And these theorists basically spoke about you need to be quick and sensitive, quick so that you can do these transformative kind of reports and pioneer the work, but then also to cross cultural boundaries. And then the final contribution is to remain objective and independent. I think that's also very important for any journalistic skill, but specifically when referring to gender-based violence issues occurring in the LGBTIQ community and when talking about Queer Side. So there are a couple of articles over and above the one being presented here today. And if you want to read them more, they are on my website, and I've included a QR code. So you are more than welcome to visit the site, read a little bit more.